Welcome, episode number 33 of the American Regularis podcast. I'm your host, JD Walter, and we're going to have a short and sweet one today. A lot to do today for me personally, basically because the Chiefs and the Huskers are on a bye week this week as I'm doing this, and I'm recording on Saturday, which I usually try to do it during the week, but my day's kind of more open, so I'm going to try to get some chores done, do some yard work and all that. Trying to rush in or sneak in a podcast in the meantime because I've been meaning to talk to you. Because of that, there's going to be some brevity to this podcast. There's going to be some levity to this podcast. It's going to be more on the side of entertainment. We're not going to get into anything too dark and grisly, though it's an important narrative that we have to talk about, or an important topic we talk about from time to time, and that's gun control. There hasn't been a giant jump in legislation. I mean, we hear about echoes and whispers of, not even whispers. I think Kamala's pretty open about, she platforms an assault weapons ban, right? Which I think any God-fearing American should be against, and we'll get into that later. But we're not going to pick on Kamala today. We're going to pick on Jon Stewart, because some of you may have seen this. He had a hot take about gun control this week, and it was just terrible. How terrible was it? I'll tell you right now. I actually don't have to take down and break apart Jon Stewart's argument on gun control, because his argument defeated itself. It was the Ouroboros, right? Have you ever see that snake that eats its own tail, right? If they starve, snakes are dumb, right? They're a dumb reptile. But a snake can be so hungry, there are times when it confuses its own tail as a possible source of sustenance, right? And it eats itself. This has become a symbol in history. And I believe it's Greek. The Ouroboros is the name for this snake eating itself, which it makes a great symbol, right? The Ouroboros is a great symbol to show you that something can destroy itself through stupidity and desperation, I guess. That's Jon Stewart's gun control argument. I don't want to beat around the bush any more than that, but now you know a great word. Ouroboros, great word. Can't really spell it. I think it's like Ourobro. Greek spelling's not always the easiest, but let's just go straight to listening to our friend Jon Stewart, who, look, I want to give him credit on this stuff. I still like listening to him. He's funny. He's had good points. He stood up for Ron Paul 15 years ago or something. Good Lord, however long it's been. And there's some things to like about Jon Stewart. Some of it's me being sentimental, because he also has a ton of bad takes. But let's listen to him talk about, this is in reference, and I think there will be a brief clip of it. This is in reference to Elon Musk talking about how the Second Amendment is there to protect the First Amendment. This is conservative 101. Everyone kind of knows that as one of the banners that you gather around, right? When defending the Second Amendment, you go, well, it's the one that protects the other amendments. And the First Amendment is, the first for a reason. It's, there's a hierarchy in the Bill of Rights, you could say. And the First Amendment's at the top, but the second one's so important because it protects it and all the others. That's the whole shtick. Nothing new from Elon, but I think Jon Stewart had a bold attempt at a new take, and I think it fell on its face. So, without further ado,
yet Trump has threatened almost all of them with either imprisonment, lawsuits, or censoring, which is why this one section of this weekend's rally in Pennsylvania was so striking, when Elon Musk was discussing why he supports Donald Trump.
The other side wants to take away your freedom of speech. You must have free speech in order to have democracy. That's why it's the First Amendment.
Elon, were you not watching the rest of the show? A movie Trump doesn't like is going to get sued. A tech mogul he doesn't like, he wants to put in prison. It's not free speech if only Trump's admirers get to do it without consequence. That's just not how it works. It doesn't go that how his support of free speech is expose the belly-worthy. I just don't. But at least the Constitution remains intact and is there to ensure that we have the First Amendment.
The Second Amendment is there to ensure that we have the First Amendment.
Guns don't protect our free speech. Our free speech is protected by the consent of the governed.
Okay, let's stop there. So the first thing they were talking about, we're going to kind of breeze through because I'm not going to say that Trump is the ardent supporter, and like he's not the paragon or the paladin of free speech. So I won't contend with Jon Stewart's claims, nor am I an expert on exactly the lawsuits and stuff he's talking about. So I will give him that. I think it's weird that they so quickly laughed at this last bit. We're going to go back just a second. But for the backdrop of this, he does bring up that Trump isn't the defender of free speech. That's fine. I'm not going to argue that. I'm going to argue the part about the Second Amendment. So, all right, moving back.
The Second Amendment is there to ensure that we have the First Amendment.
Guns don't protect our free speech. Our free speech is protected by the consent of the governed laid out through the Constitution. It's not based on the threat of violence. It's based on elections, organizing, referendums, a judicial system. Our social contract offers many, many avenues to remedy these issues and allows sides to be heard and adjudicated. Guns, from what I can tell, seem to mostly protect the speech of the people holding the gun. It's a tool of intimidation. And if I may finish, listen, motherfuckers, I'm not done. It is a tool of intimidation, and one that I think is actually being irresponsibly and recklessly invoked. Because some people in your crowd thought they might have been shadow banned by Facebook. I mean, for God's sakes, you guys are in Butler, Pennsylvania. The whole reason you're there is because some fucking asshole with an AR-15 tried to permanently litigate his vision of this country's free speech. That's why you're there.
All right, I think that's enough. You're going to recognize, probably listening to that right away, where there's a lot of stuff wrong with this speech, or this little argument of Mr. Stewart's here. Where it falls the most flat on his face is when he says guns protect only the speech of the people holding the guns. Yeah, that's the reason they wrote the Second Amendment, John. They wrote it so that people could hold the guns to protect their rights. That was what Elon was saying. That's what you used to try to dispel it while validating it and taking your own one off. Like, that was the Ouroboros. That was the snake eating its own head. He tries to argue away the necessity of the Second Amendment and its utility in protecting the First and other amendments. And when he tries to argue it, he provides the exact same sentiment and line of thinking that he was arguing against. That's a snake eating its own head. Besides that, we recognize, yes, the government would have the freedom of speech. The citizens wouldn't because they'd be unarmed. He also says other stuff, that the First Amendment is not protected by the consent of the government, but elections, right? Which are much easier to corrupt, I think, than firearms. We also have to recognize that the democratic process can produce results that strip away freedoms. I don't think, if you look at different vote laws, let's look at the Jim Crow laws of the 1950s and 40s, and they're on before then, right? How many of those laws, right, that were created by people through elections, that were elected, how many of those people created laws that stripped away freedoms or prevented freedoms, right? They're all stripped away because freedoms aren't granted by the government. right? They're into the individual. So the government can't create rights. They can only strip them away. And when those laws, when all these blacks in the South are denied their rights, it was through an elective democratic government, all right? So it's not through elections, right? What do you think the enslaved, right, during the 17th through 19th centuries would have preferred, right? To let certain people vote on it, or to be so armed to the teeth that you couldn't deny them their rights, right? Which do you think would have scared the slave owners more? Right? They said, hey, count them as 3/5 of a vote. Now, obviously, that was for different reasons. That wasn't to actually give them any sort of representation. But I guarantee you, the slave owners would have been much more worried about a bunch of muskets and Winchesters, whatever the time frame is, right? Some sort of comparable arms over the time. They would have been very much more worried about that than saying, hey, these guys are going to be able to vote, because they were still outnumbered. He goes on, the social contract remedies these issues. They need to be heard. They need to be adjudicated. Again, this happens all the time ineffectively. If the citizens, who says the citizens are going to get to be able to be heard or adjudicated if they have no violent recourse, right? Now, in a great enough society, maybe you don't have to worry about that, but it's imperfect. And even if the society is a great society, the government will continue to corrupt itself and deny people this. It's how it works. And when there's a totalitarian regime, do we send them lawyers? Do we send them legal books and show them the Magna Carta? Those aren't the worst ideas. I would love it if a lot more places could look at the Constitution, especially the United States, and the Magna Carta and derive some ideas from it. But then what? Is that what we do? No. We arm the rebels, right? And I'm not for that. I'm not an imperialist. I'm not a neocon war hawk. But why are they giving those guys guns? For their freedom. Right? Isn't that why we're always liberating these places overseas, whether they like it or not? Isn't it always for their freedom? Huh. Michael Malice, one of the greatest quotes is Michael Malice saying, all I'm asking for is the right to the same weapons that I paid for the Taliban to own. Right? The Mujahideen, the Taliban, everyone else that we've armed. ISIS. Right? Al-Nusra. The Azov Brigade, every one of these terrible entities that we've armed and equipped, right? We believe they should have arms because it suits the government's purpose. Is it because we were wanting them? What? We were wanting them not necessarily to be free. Those guys were public tools. But if we were a free nation, shouldn't citizens have this before they pay for it for nefarious and immoral agents and organizations? One would think. Furthermore, when Jon Stewart tells us that guns protect only the speech of the people holding the guns, he goes, hey, look, it's a tool of intimidation. Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of efficacy to firearms without them being fired, right? Just the threat of the possibility of the public, the citizenry rebelling helps keep the rights in place or unmolested to an extent. I mean, they've certainly, our rights are much weaker than they should be. They're infringed upon greatly all the time. Perhaps they're not intimidating enough. I know Biden was multiple times on camera. You can look it up. He's like, what is that AR-15 going to do? We got F-15s and F-16s. And he's basically saying, I will turn the military against you if you were to run up. So, that AR-15, it's not enough anymore. We've got the largest military in the history of the world, and we'll be able to kill you whether you got those guns or not, so you might as well give them up. That's what's being implicitly said there. So, yeah, maybe they're not intimidating enough, but he recognizes what that part was for. I think that's very telling. Oh, okay. So, they use it as a tool of intimidation. He was saying, you're not scaring us, we're scaring you, right? He'll do what he wants. Remember, this was during the height of the COVID tyranny, of all the rights they were stripping during that. That's when he started saying that. There's a reason he was starting to say it. Maybe we were closer at that point to using our Second Amendment, not for shooting prairie dogs, not for bird hunting or anything. They try to make it about hunting, like the left will try to make the Second Amendment about hunting. No one believes for a second that that's what it's actually about. Maybe we were closer to where they decided that they had to talk about theirs and use theirs as a tool of intimidation. But that's what it is. That isn't a tool of intimidation. Yes, absolutely. Hopefully, it can just be relegated to a tool of intimidation and people don't actually have to pick up arms against their fellow countrymen, right? Civil wars are terrible. All wars are terrible. Civil wars have their own unique heinousness to them. And, at the end, Stewart says the whole reason he's back in Pennsylvania is because a guy tried to use a gun to shoot at Donald Trump. And I believe firmly that's what the Second Amendment's there to rebel against a government that doesn't abide by the Constitution, that's infringing on the freedom of the American people. I think that's why they put it there. I don't think that time's come. I don't think we're close to that. And I pray to God it never is that way. They called Trump Hitler. They called him a dictator. They said he wasn't going to give over power peacefully. And he wouldn't there wouldn't be a peaceful transition of power. And then there was, but then it wouldn't be the next time. And it was the worst thing since September 11th. They said enough stuff to maybe confuse a kid into thinking that it was his civic duty. Like that was their language in hyperbole. And by the way, it's wrong. He made the wrong decision. But the arms, when it comes down to it, it's an ugly, scary thing to say because it's a bad thing. That's what the Second Amendment's there for. The Second Amendment is there to take up arms against your government or an encroaching government. Now, I would even say it's even more about our government than an encroaching government because the Founding Fathers, when we were writing this, a large part of the Second Amendment was to not have to be burdened with paying for a defense, right? A military. We obviously know that that's out of the bag, or that's out the window. We were saying, hey, yeah, we'll have a militia. We'll just call up the feared, like the old Anglo-Saxon way or whatever. We'll just gather the banners and bring people. We won't have a standing army, right? We clearly have a standing army now. It's the largest of all time. No one's ever spent this much money on a military in the history of the world. Okay, so that part of the Second Amendment isn't really being used or as effective now. So now it is. It's literally the Second Amendment is about our domestic government more than a foreign government. And by the way, it's even more so again about the domestic government because they have the largest military in the world against them right now. So, yeah, it is an ugly thought. And maybe if we can just all adhere to the ethos of liberty and the Founding Fathers' intent for this nation, or just the natural rights of man, well, we don't ever have to worry about this, right? There's a lot there, but Jon Stewart did not address any of it. I'm just going to leave you guys with a few quotes. I like history; it's kind of my thing, and there's so many people that I think fine, we're going to listen to Rosie O'Donnell or Ellen DeGeneres or Jon Stewart or some son of a gun on TV that I don't know, Jimmy Kimmel, whoever, someone that's like funny and maybe they had their own movie at one point, and like that's who America wants to listen to. So I thought I would just draw up some people from history. A lot of this is about firearms. A lot of this is just about arms in general, right? Because some of these people predate the advent of gunpowder and firearms by thousands of years, 1,000 years in some case. So, all right. Machiavelli, right? Author of The Prince. The Swiss are well armed and enjoy great freedom. When he wrote that, he clearly was saying that this is not a coincidence, right? This is corollary or causal. Aristotle, right? He knows something about empire. He taught Alexander the Great. Those who have the command of the arms in a country are masters of the state and have it in their power to make what revolutions they please. Thus, there is no end to observations on the difference between the measures likely to be pursued by a minister backed by a standing army and those of a court awed by the fear of an armed people. So, yeah, if you got the arms, you can do whatever you want. If the people you're ruling have weapons, everything's different, right? There is no end to the observations of the things that are different. A little more contemporary, George Orwell from 1984 fame. The totalitarian states can do great things, but there is one thing they cannot do. They cannot give the factory worker a rifle and tell him to take it home and keep it in his bedroom. That rifle, hanging on the wall of the working class flat or laborer's cottage, is the symbol of democracy. It is our job to see that it stays there. Right? And then lastly, let's get a founding father in there. Thomas Paine, who was a political philosopher of the American Revolution, said, "Arms, like laws, discourage and keep the invader and plunderer in awe and preserve order." They're a deterrent, right? And if you don't think the government will invade you, you could, I don't know, check out Waco, see when they bombed Philadelphia. You could look, and if you don't think they'd plunder you, go look at a paycheck, right? So, the Second Amendment does protect the First Amendment, and it protects a heck of a lot more than that. As it slowly erodes, we'll see the others erode. Go look where there isn't a Second Amendment. Canada's gun laws are stricter. Their First Amendment, their freedom of speech is terribly violated compared to ours. I think it's even worse in England on both sides. I think it's even harder for firearms to be owned, and I believe their freedom of speech is even more encroached upon. They have no First Amendment. Germany, just go through the list. Go through it. All right, and find me if this isn't a causal or corollary thing like our friend Machiavelli might have noticed, right? If he were writing The Prince in 2024, I wonder what he would have said about COVID. I wonder what he would have said about contemporary things, right? I'm not saying he'd be against it. Like, Machiavelli had no problem with power. He was just very much from the school of realism. All right. Always good to end with wishing Machiavelli was around. If you liked what you heard today, follow me on Twitter at reg_American1. You can email me at AmericanRegularispodcast@gmail.com. Like and subscribe on anything you're listening to. iTunes, Spotify, all the good ones. YouTube. All right. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.